It began with a quiet night at a roadside motel on the outskirts of San Antonio. The kind of place where neon lights flicker just a little too much, where the walls are too thin, and the parking lot is littered with cigarette butts and forgotten receipts. A place meant for brief encounters, for secrets exchanged in dimly lit rooms, where promises are whispered and betrayals are sealed behind doors that lock with a rusty click. Inside room 206, a man and a woman sat across from each other, drinks in hand, unaware that their time was running out. He, a husband with a wandering heart. She, the woman who had become his escape. They had done this before, many times, in fact. This was their routine. The lies had been rehearsed, the excuses memorized. The world outside didn't matter here. But something was different tonight. Something was waiting for them in those glasses they held so carelessly, something neither of them could taste or smell, something that was already working its way into their blood. The security footage would later reveal it all in haunting detail. No audio, just the grainy black and white movements of two lovers turned victims. The woman was the first to react. A sudden shift in posture, a slight tremor in her fingers as she set her glass down too quickly. Her breathing changed, shallow, uneven. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Then came the pain, searing through her chest, her stomach. Her hands clutched at her throat as if something inside was clawing to get out. The man was next. He barely had time to notice before his own body betrayed him. His limbs seized, his head snapped back, his fingers convulsed around the armrest of the chair. And then, standing in the doorway, was the woman who had set it all into motion. She didn't rush forward. She didn't call for help. She just watched. Watched as they fell to the floor, writhing, gasping, their bodies shutting down in the exact way she had planned. She did not look away. She did not flinch. And when the worst of it had passed, when the struggle turned into stillness, she did something that would forever haunt the investigators who studied the footage. She smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. The kind that carried no remorse, no regret. A smile that said everything was exactly as it should be. This is the story of a marriage built on empty vows, of betrayal traced through the screen of a smartphone, of a woman who learned that love was not always kind. It is the story of how technology led her to a truth she could never unsee, and how she chose to make them pay for it. But before we uncover the chilling details, make sure you're subscribed to Beyond the Evidence, where we unravel the darkest true crime stories piece by piece. Hit like, turn on notifications, and let's begin. Brenda Nichols had spent years perfecting the art of being the perfect wife. She knew how to press a shirt so crisp that the seams could cut. She knew how to cook a meal that warmed the soul, how to smile when the neighbors came around, how to nod in silent agreement when Frank made a decision, no matter how much it chipped away at her own desires. To the world, she was the heart of the Nichols family. A devoted wife. A mother of two. A woman who walked into church on Sundays with her head held high, dressed in soft pastels, holding a Bible she had read so many times the pages had begun to curl at the edges. There was a video of her from a Mother's Day service, recorded just a few years before everything changed. She stood at the pulpit, hand steady, her voice carrying across the congregation with a practiced ease. "A mother is the foundation of a home," she had said, her words measured, deliberate. "She is the hands that comfort, the voice that guides, the heart that forgives. A mother loves without condition, even when she is not loved the same in return." The room had hummed with approval. Brenda had smiled, stepping down to the soft embrace of applause. But if anyone had been watching closely, truly watching, they might have noticed the way her fingers gripped the podium just a little too tightly. The way her smile flickered, a moment of strain stretching across her face before she tucked it away. Frank Nichols had not been watching closely. Frank Nichols had never watched closely. Their marriage had started like most do, full of promise, full of words that felt heavier than air, thick with meaning and devotion. But over the years, the weight of those words had thinned. Love had become duty. Devotion had become obligation. And Brenda had become something expected, something unnoticed, something necessary but unremarkable. The moment she would later remember with crystal clarity, the moment that would sit inside her, hardening into something unmovable, came on their 25th wedding anniversary. There is a home video of that day, shaky footage filmed by their son. The living room is decorated with silver balloons, a banner draped across the mantel reading 25 Years of Love, in cursive print. Frank stands at the center, looking at ease, looking comfortable. Brenda sits beside him, her smile warm but uncertain, waiting as he reaches behind the couch to retrieve a wrapped box. She leans forward slightly, anticipation flickering in her eyes. And then she opens it. A vacuum cleaner. The room is filled with polite laughter. Their son snickers from behind the camera. Their daughter claps lightly. Frank smiles, claps Brenda on the back, and says, "Figured you could use a new one." Something inside her shifts. There is a second, one brief, barely perceptible second, where Brenda's smile falters, where something in her expression flickers like a candle just before it goes out. Then, just as quickly, it's gone. She forces a chuckle, nods, says something about how thoughtful he is. But later that night, when the guests have gone home and the house is silent, she will sit at the kitchen table and stare at that vacuum for a long, long time. She will think about the years she has given. The meals cooked. The laundry folded. The prayers whispered over a man who no longer saw her. She will think about the love she had poured into a man who had, in return, given her a machine meant for cleaning his floors. She will think about what it means to be unseen. And then, though she won't know it yet, she will begin to change. Because that vacuum was never just a vacuum. It was a message. It was a reminder. And it was the moment that planted a seed. A seed that would take root. A seed that would grow into something terrible. Something deadly. Brenda Nichols had learned to live in silence. She had spent years swallowing her disappointments, tucking them into the empty spaces between conversations that no longer held meaning. It had become second nature, the way she let Frank's coldness slip past her, the way she convinced herself that a quiet, steady marriage was better than no marriage at all. But the silence had a weight to it, a pressure that grew heavier with every passing day. And one night, in the dim glow of their bedroom, that weight became unbearable. Frank had fallen asleep beside her, his breath slow and even. His phone rested on the nightstand, the screen dark, his secrets locked away behind a password she wasn't supposed to know. But Brenda knew. She had known for weeks. Maybe even months. The truth had been there, hidden in the way he touched her less, the way his excuses had become predictable. Late nights at work. Business trips that didn't make sense. The scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his shirts. She had ignored it at first, pushing the doubt to the back of her mind, telling herself that she was imagining things. But doubt has a way of growing, of gnawing at the edges of reason until it demands to be seen. And that night, as she lay beside her sleeping husband, Brenda could no longer ignore it. Her fingers hovered over his phone for a moment, hesitation curling around her like a warning. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she picked it up, tapped in the code, and watched as the screen unlocked. The messages were there, waiting for her. A name she didn't recognize. A conversation that stretched back for months. Tanya Lewis. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the texts, her breath catching in her throat. I miss you already. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. I love you. The words blurred together, a sickening pattern of betrayal unfolding before her eyes. And the worst part? The timestamps. Some of these messages had been sent mere hours after Frank had kissed her goodnight. Her hands trembled as she scrolled further, finding pictures, Tanya's face, her smile, her body wrapped in sheets that were not Brenda's. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the sound of her own breath uneven and ragged. The silence she had lived in for so long shattered in an instant. But Brenda didn't cry. She didn't wake Frank up and demand answers. She simply set the phone back down, carefully, deliberately, as if it were something fragile. And then she made a decision. The next morning, when Frank left for work, she went to the store. Not for groceries. Not for cleaning supplies. For an AirTag. It was small, no bigger than a coin. A tiny piece of technology designed to keep track of lost things. But Brenda wasn't interested in finding something she had lost. She was interested in finding something Frank had hidden. That evening, as he showered, she slipped it into his truck, tucked neatly under the driver's seat, out of sight, unnoticed. And then she waited. It didn't take long. The next night, as Frank kissed her on the cheek and muttered something about working late, Brenda sat on the couch, her phone in her lap, watching. A blinking dot moved across the map. Not to his office. Not to a meeting. To a roadside motel. The same motel. Again. And again. Each night, she followed that little, watching it settle in the same spot, its betrayal undeniable. Technology had made the world smaller, but for Brenda, it had made her husband's deception feel larger than life. And as she stared at that glowing night after night, something inside her hardened. She thought about the texts. The words that had once belonged to her, now whispered to another woman. She thought about the vacuum. The years she had given. The love she had poured into a man who had made her invisible. And then, Brenda thought about something else. A way to make sure that Frank would never underestimate her again. A way to make sure Tanya never took anything from her again. She closed the app. Set her phone aside. And she smiled. There is something about betrayal that changes a person. It doesn't happen all at once. It festers, like a wound that refuses to heal, like a slow rot spreading beneath the surface of something once whole. At first, Brenda Nichols had done nothing but watch. She had let the blinking dot on her phone tell its cruel little story night after night, had memorized the exact route Frank took to the motel, the precise time he checked in, the length of his stays. She knew when he was with Tanya before he even kissed her goodbye. But knowing wasn't enough. The rage came in waves. Some days, it was cold and calculating, filling her with a strange kind of clarity. Other days, it was fire, hot, unbearable, consuming her from the inside out. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she should confront him, if she should scream, break things, make him see what he had done to her. But anger alone was useless. She needed something more. And so Brenda did what she had always done. She planned. It started subtly. She spent more time alone, avoided conversations. Her friends noticed, asked if she was feeling all right. She smiled, said she was fine. But the truth was, she was changing. She found herself in the library one afternoon, wandering through the aisles without direction, until her fingers brushed against the spine of an old book. A Guide to Texas Flora. She pulled it from a shelf, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly, until her eyes landed on something that made her breath catch. A delicate pink flower, beautiful and unassuming. Oleander. She read the description once, then twice, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Every part of the plant is toxic. A single leaf, if ingested, can stop the heart. Extracts can be mixed into liquid, undetectable to taste. Symptoms mimic a heart attack. Brenda closed the book, pressing her fingers against the cover. That night, she started keeping a diary. She had never been one for journaling, never felt the need to spill her thoughts onto a page, but now the words came easily. They filled the empty space inside her, gave form to the chaos in her mind. At first, they were scattered, fragments of anger, pieces of pain. I gave him everything. 25 years. A lifetime. She thinks she's won. And then, as the days passed, the words changed. They wanted heat. I gave them hellfire. Brenda became careful, precise. She went to nurseries, pretending to be interested in gardening. She asked about oleander, nodded politely when the staff warned her to keep it away from pets, from children. She smiled, thanked them, bought a few plants for the front yard. No one questioned her. At the grocery store, she moved with the same quiet deliberation. She picked up a bottle of bourbon, Frank's favorite, running her fingers along the glass before setting it gently into the cart. And beside it, almost as an afterthought, she placed a small bundle of oleander leaves, wrapped in a plastic produce bag. No one looked twice. Because why would they? She was just a wife, doing her shopping. Just a woman, picking flowers. Just Brenda. And no one, not the cashier, not the friends who had known her for years, not even Frank himself, saw the truth pressing against the surface. No one saw what was coming. The motel was the kind of place that didn't ask questions. The neon vacancy sign flickered in the humid Texas night, buzzing faintly like a dying insect. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles, their windshields fogged with the secrets they held. The Lonesome Star Motel wasn't built for romance. It was built for affairs, for trysts that never lasted past checkout. And tonight, it was built for something else. Brenda had watched the blinking dot on her phone move down the highway, weaving through the streets like clockwork. She already knew where Frank was going, where he always went when he thought she wasn't looking. But tonight, she wasn't just watching. She was following. Frank pulled into the lot, his truck rolling to a stop in the same space he always chose, as if that mattered. Tanya arrived minutes later, stepping out of her car with a casual ease that turned Brenda's stomach. There was no hesitation, no guilt. She walked through the doorway, disappearing into room 108 as if she belonged there. Maybe, in her mind, she did. Brenda waited. She let the minutes stretch, let the anticipation settle in her bones like a second skin. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, had gone over every step until she could see it with her eyes closed. And yet, standing there in the dark, she felt something unexpected. Come. She moved with purpose, crossing the parking lot, her hand tightening around the small bag in her pocket. When she reached the door, she didn't hesitate. She knocked once, twice. A beat of silence, then footsteps. The door cracked open. Frank's expression shifted the moment he saw her. First confusion, then irritation, and finally, something else. Fear. Brenda. What the hell are you? She stepped past him, brushing against his shoulder, her gaze locking onto Tanya. The other woman was perched on the edge of the bed, her lips parting in surprise. Brenda smiled. "Mind if I come in?" They didn't have a choice. She moved through the room like she belonged there, like she had every right to be standing between them. And maybe, in a way, she did. Frank ran a hand through his hair, already gearing up for a lie. "Look, whatever you think." She held up a hand. "Relax. I'm not here to fight." She reached into her bag, pulling out a bottle of bourbon. The glass caught the dim motel light, gleaming like amber. "I just want to have a drink." Frank hesitated. Tanya shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Brenda met her gaze, holding it just long enough to make the woman squirm. "Come on," Brenda coaxed, pouring the liquid into 2 glasses. "One drink. For old time's sake." Frank exhaled, shaking his head but reaching for the glass anyway. Routine. That's what he saw. Brenda handed the other glass to Tanya, her fingers brushing against hers. The younger woman frowned. "I don't really." "You like iced tea, don't you?" Brenda cut in smoothly. "I saw some in the fridge." Tanya blinked, caught off guard. Yeah." Brenda turned away, pretending to rummage through the tiny motel fridge. When she turned back, she held a plastic cup, the tea already dark with oleander's deadly embrace. She offered it with a steady hand. Tanya hesitated. Then, she took a sip. The room settled into an uncomfortable silence. Brenda lifted her own glass in mock toast. "To love," she murmured. Frank scoffed. "Yeah, whatever." He downed his drink in one go. Brenda watched. It took 20 minutes. The first signs were subtle. Frank's fingers twitching against his thigh, Tanya shifting in her seat, rubbing at her stomach like she'd eaten something bad. Then, the tremors came. Tanya doubled over first, a sharp, choked sound escaping her lips. Frank's hand went to his throat, his eyes widening in shock. "Be Brenda." His voice cracked, the words barely forming. His body lurched, his chair scraping against the floor. Tanya collapsed. Frank followed. They writhed, gasping, their limbs jerking like marionettes with cut strings. Brenda stood over them, watching. Frank reached for her, his fingers barely grazing her ankle. His eyes, God, those eyes, were pleading. Brenda smiled. She turned, walking to the door, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The metal handle was cool against her palm. Behind her, the sounds grew fainter. And then, finally, silence. She stepped into the night, inhaling the warm Texas air. She never looked back. The call to 911 came in at 2:47 a.m., the motel manager's voice shaking with panic. I don't know, man. Something's wrong. They're shaking, foaming at the mouth. And this woman, she just walked out like nothing happened. Stay calm, sir. Are they breathing? I don't think so. Oh God, please. I think they're dead. The line crackled with static, the motel manager's desperate breaths filling the air. Meanwhile, outside, beneath the flickering neon of the Lonesome Star Motel sign, Brenda Nichols slipped into her car. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable as she started the engine. Without a second glance, she drove off into the night. Small towns have long memories. By sunrise, the Lonesome Star Motel was swarming with police. Yellow tape stretched across the door to room 108, the morning breeze making it flutter like broken wings. A small crowd had already gathered, locals in their bathrobes, some still clutching steaming mugs of coffee, whispering among themselves. "Did you hear?" Someone murmured. "They said it was poison." They said she just walked out, like it was nothing. The motel manager stood off to the side, still rattled from the night before, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. He had seen many things in this place: drunken fights, drug deals, infidelity that ended in fists slamming against walls. But never this. Never two people dying at once, their bodies contorted in ways that didn't seem natural. And never a woman like Brenda Nichols, calm as anything, slipping into the night while the poison worked its way through her husband's veins. Her name spread like wildfire. By noon, reporters were parked outside the Nichols home, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward in hopes of catching a reaction. But the house stood silent, its windows dark. Inside, Brenda's son sat on the couch, his hands laced together so tightly his knuckles turned white. He hadn't spoken since the police arrived. Hadn't moved much either, because he had known. Not the full extent, not the plan in its entirety, but he had seen the signs. The way his mother had changed. The way she had stopped caring about the little things: dinner at the table, Sunday morning service, small talk about his classes. She had been distracted. She had been planning. And now, his father was dead. And so was she. Because Brenda Nichols was no longer a wife, no longer a mother. She was a murderer. They found her at a gas station 3 towns over, wiping down her hands with a paper napkin, as if she could erase the blood that way. The police moved in quietly. They didn't need sirens. Brenda looked up as they surrounded her, blinking as if surprised. Then she sighed. Like she had expected this all along. She didn't resist. Didn't argue. She simply nodded when they asked her name, nodded when they placed the cold steel of the cuffs around her wrists. The officer leading her to the car hesitated before pushing her inside, as if he, too, had heard the rumors. Was she a woman betrayed, driven to the edge? Or was she something else entirely? They called it the Poison Widow case. The courtroom was packed from the first day, the gallery filled with neighbors, reporters, and people who had never met Brenda Nichols in their lives but had come anyway, hungry for a front-row seat to the unfolding tragedy. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer. They showed the text messages, the AirTag data, the diary pages where she had scribbled notes on plant toxicity. They brought in toxicologists, crime scene analysts, the motel manager who swore Brenda hadn't so much as glanced back when she left. But it was the defense that made people shift in their seats. Because they didn't argue that Brenda hadn't done it. They argued why she had. They showed pictures of the vacuum Frank had given her on their anniversary. Played home videos where his voice dripped with condescension. They read aloud texts he had sent to Tanya, vile, disgusting things, while Brenda had been at home, cooking his meals, washing his clothes. And for some, that was enough. The town was split. Some saw Brenda as a woman pushed too far. Others saw a calculating killer. But one person remained silent. Tanya's husband sat in the back row every day of the trial, his face unreadable. When a reporter finally cornered him outside, asking if he had known about the affair, he simply nodded. "I knew," he said. "I let it play out." He never spoke about it again. Brenda's son took the stand on the 3rd day. He was 19, but in that moment, he looked younger, smaller, as if the weight of the truth was pressing him down. The defense attorney asked him about his childhood, his mother, his father. The prosecutor asked about the vacuum. At first, he didn't answer. The courtroom was silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, She'd been planning this since their 25th anniversary. His gaze lifted, locking onto Brenda's across the room. Since the vacuum. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor leaned forward. How do you know that? Brenda's son swallowed hard. Because I heard her, he admitted. The night he gave it to her after everyone left, she was in the kitchen, just standing there, staring at it. He exhaled, shaking his head. And she said, his voice cracked. She said, I'll show him what I'm good for. Brenda's hands curled into fists on the defense table. For the first time, she looked nervous. Because no matter what story her lawyers spun, no matter how much they argued, she had been pushed beyond her limits. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated. And now, everyone knew it. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The judge asked the foreman to stand. In the matter of Brenda Nichols, how do you find the defendant? A beat of silence. Then, guilty. Brenda didn't flinch. She only exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath since the moment she first knocked on the door of room 108. Her son closed his eyes. Tanya's husband let out a slow breath. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the weight of the decision sinking in. Brenda Nichols, the perfect Southern wife, would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Some people wept for her. Others didn't. And somewhere, in the back of a forgotten evidence locker, a battered old vacuum sat collecting dust. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Brenda as she was led into the darkened hallway, the reality of her fate sinking in with each echoing step. The weight of the trial, the weight of her own actions, crushed her. And in that moment, she realized something she had never fully understood until now. Vengeance is a cold companion, and it always leaves the heart empty. The world outside would go on without her, moving forward, healing, forgetting. But not everyone would forget Brenda Nichols. Not for a long time. The coldness in her eyes, the calculated way she had orchestrated their deaths, it would haunt the town long after she was locked away. And yet, there were whispers of a new case, a new horror just waiting to unfold. The dark corners of the world never stay still for long. I know you're sitting there, wondering what could possibly come next. What new twist of fate, what new tale of betrayal and horror could top this one? Let me tell you something. What Brenda Nichols did. It's only the beginning. You think you've seen the darkest of human nature? You think that this twisted tale of poison, betrayal, and deadly revenge is the worst the world has to offer? I promise you, there are stories darker than this one. Stories where the lines between right and wrong blur into nothingness. And when that darkness comes, it'll be so much more than you ever expected. So, here's your chance. Hit that like button. Subscribe. Turn on those notifications. Because, believe me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. This is Beyond the Evidence, where the truth is far darker than anything you could imagine. Where we bring you the twisted, the terrifying, the unimaginable, and show you just how deep the darkness runs. Trust me, when you think you've seen it all, that's when the real terror begins. Stay tuned. You never know what's lurking just around the corner.